So for those that are new, I think you know everybody, but I just want to send out a reminder that these seminar series, both the programming and data and evaluation, are brought to you by the CSAC Support Hub for Criminal Justice Programming. Through the Support Hub, we have what we're calling a strategic framework, and that was designed to really cover improving evidence-based and data-driven practices from A to Z at your county. This focuses really on building capacity at the county level, led by technical assistance from our in-house experts to really guide through those individual components, of which these series are intended to cover in their entirety. If you've just joined us this time for the first time, previous recordings of all of the discussions before today are available on our website, and the link was just sent to. Okay, so we got to this slide, and it is the same time that I talk about this every single programming series because I want this to just be so embedded in your brain. This is really what we're looking at today is a strategic framework again. The framework that has really the ability to create the vision and a path for how to achieve that vision. It's an oversimplified way of saying that it's really how can you as a county make better and more informed decisions within your county programming. These components really set you up to do that and create that foundation. How do you get everything out of your programs that you want to and hope to? The theory behind the framework is that it helps conceptualize these key components that really build on each other to improve those practices that I've just discussed. So first component, we have the program inventory and literature review. What programming do you have, and is it truly evidence-based and effective? What are the critical things that you're thinking about when you're designing interventions or programming within your county? Either as a current program, developing a new one, or revisiting an old program. The program inventory and the literature review really help get started on educating yourself around those conversations. The goal there is to really create a cross-agency list of programs with specific descriptions, budget information, and then ultimately crosswalk all of that information to the evidence and literature that exists, really telling you foundationally if you're on the right path. Next, we have logic models and process maps. All those, they sound really daunting if you've never done them. They can become so vital in how you design, redesign, or even look at what you're trying to accomplish. It's a part of what we'll be talking about today, and really asking yourself, what do you want from this program? How do you know what to expect from it? And do we have missing pieces in the process? How do we get there? How do we fix it? How do we communicate about those? Importantly, when we talk about logic models today, they really help outline a theory of change for a program. Process maps that we're going to be talking about today help improve efficiency, communication, and expectations. And then we'll walk through really how to accomplish these and feel really good about the programmatic foundation that you're building within your county by using these tools. In the middle of the framework, we have contracting practices. So you've outlined your program, you've designed them, you understand the literature that surrounds them in the first component. You've done the work in terms of logic models and process maps to make sure you're focused in the right area, that you're looking at the right things, and you understand what you're actually aiming to achieve. And now really, how do you put that into practice? How do you develop RFPs, engage providers, and target outcomes that ultimately match to the budgeting? Really, again, in this contracting practices, you're looking at how to achieve accountability and fidelity in order to really get to those intended results that you had designed in the previous steps. Notably, this work doesn't have to be direct contracting. The concepts that we are talking about in all of these seminars can really be applied to anyone that is either designing program or even operationalizing it at the ground level. And then about half the discussion today will be around the contracting practices piece of this. Next, we have data strategies and dashboards. You've done all the operational work in developing the programs, figuring out how you should contract them, but now how do you really know they're working? So data strategies and dashboards help in monitoring populations, programs, and outcomes across systems. They create views for a variety of audiences, from everything from your local day-to-day operations to public-facing transparency details. In these discussions, we focus on, are you looking at the right kinds of information? What kind of information is relevant? How do you merge information? Really, dashboards can be a display of random things oftentimes, especially when we're just collecting things and want to display something. All of these efforts really target what to put up there, why it matters, and really how to achieve kind of monitoring those programs that you've designed. And then equally as important in that conversation is really thinking about how you gather data and get access to pertinent data. Finally, we have the last step in the framework, which is focused around program evaluation and cost benefit analysis. Use data to develop program outputs and outcome evaluations. When you've done all of the work up to this point, you really want to focus on proving if it works. And you do that through really program and process evaluation. And that is what this last step is. This piece of the cost benefit analysis really does, in addition to just looking at does the budget match up to what you're intending to do and is it cost beneficial, this section really gives you that defensible argument of, are you doing the right things in your county? And can you actually say that it's working? If it's not, then you can also be educated in how to go back and fix those things so that it does work or improve practices around it. So really the last piece there is really focused on ensuring that you are looking at that final piece of the picture and really the puzzle that you want to get to. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Kevin. So what are we trying to accomplish in the programming series? Really, the seminar in its entirety and the series is to give counties approaches and tools for not just how to compile a range of services or programs, but really how to use the information and give the work context and nuance that it deserves so that you can do the best thing for your county. The concepts around what works have become really important in designing county responses to a range of goals, but the challenge is how to pull all of this information in a more coherent system. And the tools designed in the seminar series, on both series, are really more about bringing a sense of order to what can be a very complex conversation within agencies and even more so across agencies. Also, looking at evidence doesn't mean that we squeeze out innovation, but really gives you a process and a meaning to the word, how to use that word, and then how to plan for making that innovation become evidence-based and proving that it works within your county. The one last thing is program design in general can really be aided by getting baseline ideas of cost efficiency as well as impact. So even though interventions aren't always about money or budget, and we talk a lot about it, really making sure that you're effectively allocating those resources really has the most impact on what you're doing for your county, but also the people that you're trying to impact. And that's the ultimate goal of why we're here, right? Is to not just do the best things in terms of data figures, but how that plays out to really impacting people's lives downstream. Okay, let's go one more slide. All right, for those that love a calendar view, we are here in February of 2021, and we are going to be discussing program design and contracting. I've mentioned it earlier, but the program inventory and the assessing and applying evidence are some of the previous seminars that we discussed. And so those are available online. And then in the future, we'll be discussing cost benefit in more detail. And so today we're here. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Kevin O'Connell, who most of you probably know. He is one of our CSAC project consultants, is an absolute asset in the work, and who I'm very happy to stand beside in partnerships with our county. So Kevin, feel free to take it away.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Good morning, everybody. I think as kind of Ryan's introduction kind of gave you some notes about, like, really this is, I think our seminar today is really about thinking about how do you on the front end design programs and practices to make sure you have the most impact possible. We know that programs are complicated. They live in an environment in a county which is always somewhat changing, and also the partners may be changing. But the idea is if you put some basic tools in place, like kind of the idea is you have a better chance at having some good outcomes for your clients and a better system overall. This definitely isn't about all the answers. I don't think there are answers for a lot of these things, but it's actually some ways to get some tools in place that really enable collaboration, cooperation, and I think there's a better discussion amongst all your partners and stakeholders, which I know is a big ask sometimes. But the idea here is if there are some tools in place, you can actually get to a better place of actually using evidence and information, but not feel like basically it's something that's been kind of unilaterally decided. So I think this is all kind of offered in the spirit of collaboration and cooperation, but really kind of leveraging evidence, information, data, but in a format that feels collaborative and actually then leads to some better, better operationalization. So today we're going to cover a couple of different kind of tools. As Ryan noted, a lot of these tools will be available on our on the CSAC website as well, but kind of two major sections. One is that how do you really design programs to have the maximum impact? Looking at the participants here, I know a lot of you on this call design programs, are in this all the time, doing it, building it, trying to kind of weave together all the complex things of what you should do, what the evidence says versus what you can do versus what's really going to happen in the long term. So I think that's also, I want to give a lot of space for actually kind of some real discussion about what happens when you do try and, build the perfect rope swing, the perfect, perfect car, whatever it is, the perfect device, the perfect whatever it is. what really happens? What happens when you try and deliver good, solid programs to people? And what kind of goes wrong? And then how could you actually, on the front end, design those better to hopefully have a different impact and a better implementation? So what this is trying to do is kind of go between what is kind of program design, which actually then what really happens in implementation. And the idea here is using some of these tools can hopefully kind of bridge some of those gaps. And again, hopefully communicate a little clearer with your stakeholders. So the first section is going to cover some things we talked a little bit about in sections in webinars 1 and 2. One is like building an inventory of all the programs you offer. I think all the counties on this call have done some form of that, or actually are pretty far through that. So you got this great list. In some counties, it's 50, 60, 70 different types of interventions across lots of populations. So what do you do with that list? Where can that be a starting place? The next is actually reviewing the evidence and saying, what works? What do we know about what works? How do we make sure, as Ryan said, not to squeeze out innovation, but at least have some certainty that there's actually some theory of change that we can point to say, we know in some way this could work, and here's why we think that. So the evidence review process. Logic models are then a tool that kind of put those in place across kind of a logical operational framework and say, basically on a single sheet of paper, what do you hope to get out of this program? What's our theory of change? And what's our kind of long-term goal for this? And we have a couple examples there as well. And lastly, a kind of a tool that I think is probably, when you think about it, it's pretty intuitive, but what does that process actually look like? What's that visual representation of how a person actually moves through, 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 steps to go from, we think this person would be good for this program, to actually coming out the other side as a graduate, as a success, whatever that looks like. But how do you make sure you understand all the different touch points in that to make sure you can design the program operationally so it does actually fit in terms of who's responsible for it, but also what the actual steps in the process look like to get somebody to that program or that intervention. The second half will focus a little more on contracting as a mechanism that I think a lot of counties deal with all the time. I think a lot of counties on this call actually do a fair bit of contracting with their local CBOs. And I think the idea here is actually give some kind of ideas and pointers on how to approach that relationship, how to kind of structure the RFP, both development process, but also the collaboration process, and then also lead to, I think what also then can be a way to kind of track some outcomes and have that be a more collaborative approach. I know that's probably where the real conversation starts about, now that we have some data about how our programs are performing, what does that actually mean? But we thought this was a useful kind of place, and we do have some tools in place we've been developing for a couple of years here as a way to kind of show that. So really the idea there is to use that contracting situation as a way to kind of put out some principles and then see how that can be helpful in more of a discussion. And I think as we kind of talk about this, we're going to think about, what are the challenges actually implementing programs in a contracted environment, as well as kind of what's that trade-off between really kind of making sure someone's doing what they say in the contract versus fidelity to a model versus innovation. And all that can be kind of on a continuum. And there is a lot of times there aren't solutions, but there's just ways to approach it. And so this will offer some of those ideas. And lastly, a couple of tools and approaches to actually infuse a little more data into your actual into your planning process for the contracting, as well as things like results or RFPs. Because the idea there is that you can include more data and more of a framework for people to actually understand what you're trying to do. You actually get better responses from your things like RFPs. So the idea is to kind of use some of those tools to kind of get there. So I'm going to jump into the content here. And again, I think as a lot of you have experience doing this, I would love to kind of have the Q&A or the questions come to the chat. And we'll also stop a few times actually for questions and also for a few poll questions. So really do welcome all of your experience here. And this is really meant to be something that we do have some ideas and some frameworks for this, but in reality, this is all much more complex. And the idea here is to kind of build some tools and some ideas, not to have all the answers to answer all the questions. So the big question here, how do you actually design programs to have maximum impact? And I guess for me, I'm more of a system thinker. And I think when you kind of thinking about the justice system, and I think you've probably seen a slide like this, this is the standard, when kind of a crime happens in the community, what happens to it as you move through this very complex set of interventions, court systems, possibly, giving a sense of like on probation or parole. It kind of moves you through this whole big complex system. But what does it actually tell you about how you're actually going to intervene with somebody? What part of the system are you actually trying to intervene with them? What actually is that going to happen in terms of the rest of the system? So the idea here is to kind of think about it from the system gives you some context about where you're intervening and what kind of clients, and also what do you think that's going to have? What impact do you think that's going to have on future involvement? So I think the reason we think this is important is you got to be specific about where in the system you're intervening, else it ends up not meeting the needs of the person or being kind of the wrong fit. Or I think with probably some experience you've all had, you don't actually have the right kind of clients coming through it. So an example here is if we were to then focus a little bit on one part, we kind of zoom in here to the, kind of the correctional part of this, because a lot of people on this call are more involved with probation or folks that are justice involved in the community. How do we know what kind of programs are looking for to have an impact on good reentry outcomes? What does that look like? So even this, we're trying to focus in a little more on that kind of endpoint of the system where people move through it. And so the idea here is that there's a lot of complexity here, but probably not nearly enough for what you might want to do. Excuse me.
Kevin,
but think about the whole system gives them context.
Sorry to interrupt. I see some people are moving in and out a little bit. I just want to make sure everyone's okay, technologically speaking. So if you have any issues or you're having trouble connecting in and staying connected, feel free to let us know and we can try and figure something out for you. Sorry to interrupt, Kevin.
Okay. Idea here is to think system-wide. So this isn't the process map you'd probably think of for a program, but it does give you some a person context about where are we actually trying to intervene and what kind of pool of people are we actually looking to intervene with. So when we kind of think of our inventory of programming, this is from, kind of one of the counties that did a pretty robust set of programming inventory for a lot of different programs, both interventions, as well as kind of the, I guess, bigger placement or place where these programs happen. But they wanted to kind of look at all these different places and ways they're intervening with folks and what was the actual intervention. So for this example, they have 3 different types of programs, which I would call, cognitive behavioral interventions. But the idea here is that what are we offering to folks and at what stage? Because all 3 of these have slightly different attributes when you're actually looking at this list. So when they went through this process, they have these group of programs that are offered to people across the reentry spectrum. So both folks that are as they're exiting jail as kind of a jail or custody setting, but also as they reenter into the community, they want to have some kind of continuity of service and some kind of way to bridge that true reentry step. And so what they kind of found was when they first inventoried these programs, they had the list. And what that tells them is they've got, R&R, which is reasoning and rehabilitation, kind of a structured curriculum style cognitive behavioral therapy program. They have some employment placement services, some parenting, some also work with on the mental health delivery service around depression, and also dialectic behavioral therapy, which is also a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. So what they kind of found out was all these have really high ratings. The needs and the outcomes they're addressing are all the things they'd want to do. But what they found out is, that's great, but actually, how do we start making sure we understand why those are being used and how? And actually, when we do actually look to the community to look for resources like this, is it actually doing what we want it to do? And so you have 3 different models that all could be considered a cognitive behavioral therapy model. But in the end, how do you actually make sure, one, they're done to fidelity? Do people that are reentering actually have time in custody to complete the right amount of dosage? And if there isn't the right amount of time, how do you make sure that there is actually something on the outside to connect it to? And so in the end, you're actually thinking about, if there is an evidence base to all these, what does it actually look like? And actually, are we actually delivering in a way that actually would be evidence-based? So by going through this inventory process, you actually get some insight into not just that you're delivering a lot of programs, but are they being delivered at the right stage for the right set of people? Excuse me. And so I think the idea here is that how comparable are they? Are they actually like that? And actually can go to model a program like this. What are the kind of things we want to know? Wow, there are a lot of people coming in and out. So back to the justice system. So do we actually know the impact we're going to have? And actually, can we kind of filter this down to make sure that delivering those kind of programs will actually have the right impact and they're at the right stage of disposition, and make sure they are tailored to the amount of time and dosage someone's going to have, and not just be things we say we're offering, but not really knowing how that sets up in the system. Because if you're offering somebody who's, again, a pretrial client or pretrial release, I think it takes 26 weeks to go through on a weekly basis, they may not have the time for that, and a lot of the other ones. So to make sure they're really able to deliver the programs you're looking at in the setting you're looking, and you're actually the setting you want to do. So coming back to this, make sure you're kind of zooming into the right part of the system to then deliver the programs you're looking for. So what is a logic model? The part of the reason we kind of highlight these as a really good tool to use is that they're fairly simple to use. They're very conceptual, but the idea is that they're, I think once you start developing them, you kind of see that they're a really helpful way to communicate with your stakeholders as well as internally about what you're really trying to do with a client and what you're really trying to do programmatically. And I think what we kind of find is that even programs that already exist, that you already have out there that maybe you're doing internally, they actually help to kind of walk this through to make sure everybody's agreeing with, who you're actually trying to serve and why you're trying to do it. And then actually, what are the kind of things you can measure with some amount of a degree of success, and actually figure out if this program is actually working or not. But the idea is that the logic model presents, based on this evidence of what you think works and what is working out there in the literature, what's that theory of change? What are the outcomes you're trying to address? What are the populations that it's shown to work on? And then actually, this is your local implementation of that. Because when I think of a logic model, you can say, what's a really good logic model for cognitive behavioral therapy? But then if you're actually not thinking about what you're doing locally, you really haven't localized it. So the logic model in theory is going to be what you think is going to work locally and how you're taking that evidence and applying it to your local situation in whatever that setting is. but hopefully still aligning it with the evidence and making sure you can get the right amount of dosage, the right kind of programming, and the right population to still say, yes, we know this is linked to the evidence. Or you actually start finding out where we're innovating, where are we actually trying something new, where are we actually trying something that actually is a twist on what was been done in the past, and that's where innovation comes from. And I think there's always this push to be evidence-based because that's an easy thing to do, but logic models at least help you know where you're actually deviating from the evidence, and at least you kind of acknowledged it and you can be clear about it. And I think what this kind of shows is that there is an evidence base to what you're doing. You've done the inventory, you've looked at the literature, but also you kind of understand where it goes through a process. And I think it also helps to highlight what are the kind of data elements you want to provide to people, what are the ones you need to get from other people, and then operationally, what are the kind of things you'd actually need to share with people to actually get them what they need. And so as you walk through an example, just be a little clearer, but the idea is you're really kind of using this logic model as a way to present and collaborate on a theory of change and agree on that what matters to you locally, not just take something off the shelf from, again, the evidence or something else, but really to see how it would adapt locally to your local implementation. And so we're going to stop here for a poll. I think most folks on this call probably have experience with logic models in some ways, probably have different experience, good and bad doing it. And I think from a personal level, the reason I like them is because they are quick. If you do them right, they are not meant to be arduous tasks. And so I think we had a couple of questions for folks to see what their experience was. And so who currently uses and completes logic models for their programs or has experience doing that?
Okay, we're getting a lot of answers in. We've got a very mixed bag of responses here, which is a good thing. I think this means the conversation can really be meaningful. So a lot of people not currently completing logic models. Some of them sounds like they've done it on an ad hoc basis or with some programs. And then others are unsure of if the county is doing it. So let's, we're getting close to the end here, probably another 10 seconds. Go ahead and there we go. We closed that poll in 1 second. That's okay. So we have, I think, did you share it? Let's share the results so people can see. I think really what we're describing in here, there you go. I think everyone can see that now. I think really what we're seeing in terms of responses is this is a really meaningful conversation. And these can be simplified in a way to where you can really implement them in operational practices. So when Kevin walks through this example, I think it's a really great way to start thinking about all of the work that you've done and really kind of aligning it to the evidence and thinking about the program design. So sounds like a good conversation moving forward, and maybe some in the Q&A about how do you do this? What's an easy way to accomplish it?
And I think one of the parts that I think people often end up doing them for is either for like grant requirements, or when you're doing an external evaluation, like the requirement might be for the evaluator to actually come and create one for you. But I think we're kind of thinking about this in a little bit different ways to make sure folks almost like they use it as a way to do program design and implementation, and not just make it be a after the fact what happened, but actually be on the front end of things. And I think it's a tool that actually, I think it's not just for the evaluation folks or kind of the data analysis side. It's actually, I think the actual best users of this, that oftentimes people in kind of management are actually trying to say, this is what is in my mind of what I want to do. I'm actually taking a look at what works, and here's my vision of this, and then have kind of staff or collaborators actually, hone it in a little more. But I think it's going to be really useful for, again, kind of people actually trying to design or manage programs, not just the ones trying to evaluate it. So we don't want to make this sound like it's just for the data and analytic people. I think it's really kind of meant to be that collaborative document that really anybody can do, and then kind of figure out what's feasible for the different folks. All right, so it makes a great logic model. I think to me, it's a well-described problem. Like, what's the actual problem you're trying to actually address and make an impact on? Because too often you have, here's the program. We're just kind of putting it out there. Here's this program it's supposed to do. We think it's called this, whatever the name is, or the acronym is. It really doesn't describe the program as actually the problem it's trying to address or the impact it's trying to have. And so I think, like anybody, you need some kind of a narrative to really understand what a program does. And so I think oftentimes a really good logic model actually has a statement of what this program does, that basic description, and it all can kind of live on one document. It's simple and clear in the program design, because I think what ends up happening is you end up kind of like putting together a lot of different interventions on top of one another, end up with a very complex set of things you're trying to measure. So I think in some ways it's really meant to be as simple as possible, and not meant to be everything you would ever want to know about the program, but really the most important things to convey. And I think this works best oftentimes with things that are truly like unique interventions, not necessarily things that are, like maybe like a place or like a data reporting center has lots of different programs and services. How do you kind of get really specific about it so you know exactly how somebody moves through it, not kind of an overly complex, multi-dimensional piece of this. So I think simple is often better to try to convey it to lots of people. And then the interventions also should be grounded in solid theory. So this goes back to the evidence. What does the evidence say, and what do the evaluations say about what works, and how do we make sure and start there with a solid theory of change? It also communicates basically what we actually want to do with the interventions. What are we actually providing people? What are the activities? What are the kind of things we're actually going to be doing with this? And I think, if you kind of think about it from a business perspective or kind of like a project management approach, that's also what you would expect there. Like, what are the kind of things you actually want to do, and how do they actually translate into the goals we have? And it's also fairly systematic. We're not really talking about, we're trying to do one thing. We're actually, a lot of times we're delivering lots of different things. We try and be systematic about it. So at least the format is consistent. So if you actually basically change out the program with a different one, you actually could say, I know exactly what I'm looking at here. Maybe just some of the words have changed, but actually we're still looking at the same kind of systematic approach to the program. It also helps to kind of make sure you're changing perspectives on what the actual program is going to do, because oftentimes you're looking at it just from maybe as the county perspective or someone who's developing the program. You're not kind of turning that lens back to, well, what does the provider need, or what does the actual implementing partner? What does your officer, your probation officer need to actually make sure they can make the referrals to the program? So I think it allows you, at its best case, to be a really collaborative document. And I think the process there is kind of where that fits in. It brings in a lot of different key players and staff, and isn't just something that's created in kind of, in absence of other people. It's really meant to be a collaborative document. Someone can obviously take a stab at it, but the idea is to actually start with something that actually, is a collaborative process that gets people to the table to talk about what they think this is. So you're not trying to figure that out later, or when you're trying to implement it, you've actually done a lot of that on the front end. And I think that the best thing about it is that the ones that actually get clear about it are actually really clear about what you're trying to accomplish, not just the things that you kind of want to just put this document out there. And I think there are some organizations and counties that have started to create expectations that these would be part of any kind of a program design or a program implementation. But the idea is you want to have buy-in for it and not be something that's kind of a perfunctory, like, let's just do it because it's on the list, but actually make it a collaborative process. And I think the ones I've done are usually if you've done it 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour with a collaborative group, and then you also have really a lot better sense of what can happen there. So it doesn't have to be a long, drawn out process. This isn't like its own strategic planning day, but I think it oftentimes is meant to be kind of, let's boil it down to the basic facts. Let's be really clear about it. And then by the end of this, make sure you feel like there's a good sense of what this program can do, and not one that keeps this conversation going for a long time. So a general logic model and approach to this. You want to have a target population. So who are you actually trying to serve? And that's really important to think about. One, are you actually agreeing on who the population is you're actually trying to reach, and not just one that says people on probation or people in a certain city. Is actually kind of specific about what they need and why they need it. So you make sure you can actually get the right kind of referral once you start going there. Next is kind of the inputs and kind of what the resources are you're actually bringing to the table. And the reason this is kind of an important part of this is that a lot of times you go right to what you're going to do with it. You really haven't declared what the kind of resources you'll be using in terms of funding, in terms of actually what kind of staff you'll need to do it, and also what kind of grants or kind of fiscal information needs to be there to also understand the budget of it. And some example I would think of is that if you have you get a grant from the state to implement let's say the BSCC puts a grant out and they actually ask you for information about the inputs of it, you actually could say we have a grant from the BSCC that runs for 2 years. After that, we need to actually go and actually find other resources. But the idea is to actually line up all the different kind of parts of this that actually make up the resources you're going to use, instead of just jumping right to what you're trying to do. The activities are then kind of the tasks and really kind of what people are going to be doing to hopefully meet that goal for the logic model. So, and really kind of meet that underlying theory of change. So if we kind of put effort into these things with these resources, this is what we think we're going to get out of it. So that can be things like counseling sessions. It can be connections to services. It can be a lot of different ways to think about the activities when you get to a specific project. But the activities are really meant to be those tasks you're kind of asking people to undertake. The outputs are then what you want to get out of that. What do you want to turn those counseling sessions into? What's almost like what the program can actually control are those outputs. They can control what they turn those activities into. And then you make sure that they're actually the ones you kind of what you want to be tracking, you kind of understanding. And those things become kind of the things you might ask for them back in terms of your data tracking, in terms of your analysis. The outcomes that are kind of the longer term, I would call them intermediate effects. And I think this is where you probably could include things like recidivism, change in maybe substance use, change in attitudes, which are really much longer things out there. And oftentimes things that the provider or the program themselves really can't really control themselves, but you would like to see that if your theory of change works. So the idea here is to have these outcomes kind of set up as bigger goals for the county or for maybe for the department, and not always be something that the provider is actually directly responsible for, but something we want to kind of see in our long-term impacts. Because I think a lot of times in RFPs or even in a lot of programs, you're asking the provider to actually tell you what the recidivism rate is, or how many people actually ended up back in jail again, or who actually, all these, or who actually changed these attitudes. But really, those are things that really can be longer term and may not be actually be observable in the term of the program itself, or the term of actually that intervention. So the idea is to actually make sure the outcomes you have there are more aligned with your county or your agency's goals, but also these are sensible ways to kind of link it back to this program. So what does this look like? This is kind of a basic version of this. We also have a Word version in the link on the CSAC kind of material site. But the idea is this is for a batterers intervention program, really focused on intimate partner violence. But the idea is you have a target population on this left here. So back to those categories we put out there. Those convicted of basically domestic violence charges would be kind of the target population. And for this particular program, we want people that are low risk on the LSCMI, which is a risk assessment tool, and the ODARA, which is a domestic violence or intimate partner violence risk assessment tool. So I want low risk partner people there, as well as people that are medium and high risk intimate partner violence clients as well. Being more specific helps to make sure we're kind of talking about what kind of clients and where they are. The inputs and resources of them, the different kind of people and staff would be needed for it, the fund and where the funding might come from to support different parts of it. And then also the providers as well. Who's actually going to be providing the services and how does that look? As a way to kind of get to what are they all going to turn this into to hopefully address intimate partner violence in the county. And I think part of this is you're kind of then drawing on that theory of change as well, is that we think by targeting these clients with these kind of resources, we can then turn these into the activities that are going to reduce long-term the risk of intimate partner violence down the road, as well as recidivism that might, as long as kind of general recidivism. And so these activities then are the things we can try and count or kind of say, these are the kind of things we want someone to do or a provider to do to make sure they're making progress and to really address those, address the kind of needs of this population to avoid the outcome we want or to get the outcome we want. And then we want to turn these activities into these kind of outputs. What are the, and these can be things that have time standards, that have kind of a clear notion of what you're actually trying to do and the time frame you have with them. And the idea is to kind of make sure you're kind of like putting these out as values as well. So you want to make sure that you're actually having the activities that actually match up with some kind of output. And then in theory, you could actually have somebody, does it actually make sense to have, every person that's assessed using the LSCMI, would it actually help to turn those into these outputs on the right here? The idea is that these would actually link up together and kind of be what the provider would then turn back to you in terms of data points. And then lastly, outcomes are kind of those, again, those longer term things that maybe you aren't going to see in the term of the program itself. With batterers intervention programs, they usually run up to 52 weeks. There are 6 counties in the state actually trying like a kind of a new twist on that with kind of a more variable number, but generally 52 weeks for a batterers intervention program. And so you're not always going to see things like new convictions or avoiding restraining orders in the time you have in that program, but we'd hope to see that over the long term and definitely not within the program time as well. So I think the idea here is to kind of make sure you're kind of looking at the things the provider can control in the program, but also these longer term elements as well. And I think the other part, and kind of this is like probably a plug for the data analysis and evaluation part, is that some of the outcomes actually take a much more robust analysis to really show causality, because a big kind of challenge here is that the activities and outputs can be tabulated, can be counted, can be sent back to you, but really to kind of get to, did it work and actually did it reduce things, and was this the impact we thought it would have? You need a lot more kind of like a little more statistical analysis, as well as kind of a more sophisticated research design. And that's where you might plug in an outside evaluator or in-house research staff to make sure you can get to the kind of that, did it actually do what we thought it did? And is this the reason it did it? So it's a way to kind of point to not just do we see a change there, but actually do we see a change that we think is attributed to the intervention in the program? And so I think with that discussion about kind of what happens when you actually do try and put this in practice and actually do the work, I like it's the example I kind of think of, and it's kind of a weird thought, but like you watch Star Trek, I'm of that age, I guess I grew up kind of with those reruns, and I think even as a kind of a concept, it was always like Captain Kirk's out there fighting all these space aliens, but his job was always to gonna go where no one had gone before, but he kind of got caught up in the work of almost like every episode has really nothing to do with exploring. It's all about just like battling space aliens and doing kind of these things. So what's the purpose of Star Trek and exploring the universe if you're really not exploring anything? You're just kind of going from planet to planet fighting space aliens. So I kind of thought about in some ways, like what's the bigger purpose, and making sure people are all kind of focused on the bigger goal, not just on the day-to-day and not just because of this small kind of aspect, but what are we all here to do? What's our purpose? And I think a lot of times we have really big goals, what we want for our clients and what we want for our community, but how do we make sure we're getting to those bigger goals and not always feeling like we're just kind of stuck in a kind of an ongoing, just kind of week to week, month to month challenge, but actually kind of get refocused on the big goals. And I think implementation is where that really hits the road, because your big goals and your big ideas then come in contact with reality, be it budgets, be it capacity, be it human behavior, and where do you go from there? So I'm going to go kind of quick through these to make sure we have enough time for the full one. But the idea is that we kind of thought that big implementation questions often come down to fidelity, like what are we actually trying to do and for who? What does the research say about what we should do versus what we can do? And then also, like, how do we kind of make and understand high quality kind of processes that actually reflect what the client would actually be experiencing? So we avoid this thing where it says, we think Kevin should get this service, and somehow magically 26 steps later across 3 streets and over 3 buses and 6 different agencies, he will magically get over here to this, place of amazing change and personal development. And that's really hard. So the idea is that process maps can also help to understand implementation and where your process itself can create some barriers for that. And so the way that I think, when I think of these tools, I think of a process map kind of going with a logic model, that here's your idea of kind of what you want to measure from the evidence, but here's the actual process to get Kevin from he be good candidate to actually doing that project. And again, this is all stuff that can be done fairly quickly and intuitively, but it's all kind of a place of implementation and of discussion and collaboration. So a little bit about this, and I think probably some of you have seen this, but I thought it was an interesting kind of approach to how do you actually design with fidelity in mind. And this was a study done more on kind of like kind of both different evidence-based practices from a range of different kind of human service type programs. But when they actually went out and looked and surveyed a lot of implementers of different programs, from going from an evidence-based to actual implementation, they kind of figured out that there's always adaptations happening locally. Whenever you kind of go and create a program, you're making adaptations. That's the whole point. You're taking something and moving it to your local environment, your local population, your local services. But they found out when that people started adapting was the lack of time. So there wasn't enough time in the day or time in the program to actually do what they want. About 80% said that was the why they would change things. Limited resources. So you got the program in there, but not enough resources to actually do it as intended. You couldn't actually keep people in the program about 70% of the time. Resistance from the implementers themselves. So even though you've got the great the program in place, people that actually would be doing the work were resistant to actually doing the evidence-based model. And also then recruiting and actually getting people into the program itself. So people actually said, no, thank you, I don't want that. So there's all these reasons why you kind of go from your idea of what could work to what's actually going to happen. And I think this kind of probably summarizes most of the things that probably go on when you go from I dreamed of this and I got something else. At least you kind of know what some of those pain points are. And I think for some of that, thinking about the process can help understand what the kind of the barriers to fidelity are. And if there's barriers you want to kind of take on, you can address them, or you just say, we know that this isn't exactly what we intended, but at least we know that when we go back and look at our outcomes. So kind of what does a process map or kind of approach allow you to do? Brainstorm for kind of process improvements. A good example here is if you require somebody to have, let's say a driver's license or have some kind of a requirement like that, you're actually putting in place things that actually allow someone to get that driver's license or get that ID card. If you don't have it, how do we create a process to make sure that process is there and improving on it? It improves communication about different people's systems. Just on this call, we have at least 3 or 4 different agencies represented, from behavioral health, from probation, a couple of people from jail and the sheriff's office, CAO's office. You all may know your own world, but this can help actually improve your communication across agencies to make sure you do understand what things drive different things and where those pain points are. And I think that last item there, how do you make sure you're not creating delays or bottlenecks in services or doing the same thing over and over again if you don't actually take a look at the whole system in place? And I think more importantly, from those people kind of trying to look at, how does this actually help them differentiate or better understand what the process is? It also says, when does ownership change of a certain part of the process? Who's responsible for different parts of the process? What are the kind of metrics we can put in place to make sure that we know we want things to happen in a certain number of days or a certain time standard? But the idea here is you kind of overlay your logic model onto a process map, and this can be pretty simple. It actually helps to better understand how you're actually going to look like when you actually go to implementation. So this is an example of a jail reentry program that I worked on. And again, really simple. The idea here was just to kind of put an idea down on paper and have the agency kind of react to it. But this all kind of starts in the top left here, where you go, how does somebody even get identified to even go into the program itself? And so the question of who's even being recruited for the program on the top left here, the idea here is that you have somebody in a jail facility going out and recruiting people. Well, how does that recruiting part look like? What if somebody doesn't want to come out of their cell? What if they actually don't want to go to the day room? What if they actually are kind of hard to reach, or folks that are maybe in a different cell or a different part of a different pod? Are you actually reaching all the people you could, or is it really more the people that are already amenable, who are out in the yard, or actually doing social activities? Who are you actually reaching and how? Or is it things that are more about, like, is it through the court system? Are there people that are already kind of being given, let's say, milestone-based sentences that also might already be amenable, like attracted to the program, know they have some kind of incentive in place, who are you actually starting with, and you actually look at who you're even assessing for it. Then you go through to see, are they eligible or not? So you screen a lot of people out if they don't have enough time on their sentence possibly, or if they're maybe not eligible for the kind of housing to do the reentry program. And then also you have an assessment process that says, is this person even the right fit? Are they, are they a danger? Are they, your classification process, as it said, actually, they wouldn't be a good fit. Do they not have the high enough level of maybe substance use need or criminogenic needs to qualify for the program? You already might be screening people out based on this assessment process. And then as you kind of go through this, the inmate has to want to do it. Like they may say, no, thank you. You've assessed me, you've recruited, we've talked about it, I'm good, no, thank you. So you're already kind of losing a lot of people throughout this process possibly. Then you actually get to, let's actually do the program. Let's try and meet this person's needs around education, substance use, vocational, and education needs. Once you come out the other side of looking at how the program did, you're already kind of introducing a lot of places and opportunities for bias, if one thing, because you don't always know who is getting excluded from the program and who was in it. But also you end up kind of saying, what's actually easy for the inmate or the person to actually see it through? Did they actually know what was happening next? Were there wait lists here that you didn't have enough capacity in your program to actually meet them while they were in custody for the time they had? So it's a way to kind of look at it across the spectrum, both in custody as an example here, but also then in the community to say, did we actually have the right kind of touch points? Did they actually have any delays based on kind of the resources we had? And are we actually all talking about the same amount of dosage we're going to give this program to make sure we're all really talking about the same thing? And I think because reentry is like a lot of words, it's grown in popularity. Kind of basically anybody who's been released from jail could be considered a reentry client. It becomes so big, you really aren't really talking about the same people anymore. So this also helps you focus on who exactly are we talking about when we're looking at these populations, and are they actually all moving through the system in the same way? And I think this also helps to then help with evaluations down the road. I mentioned selection bias, but that basically means you're actually you're having unequal preference of certain people, but you're not actually identifying what that selection does to who you're actually screening. A common issue might be just like looking at low risk people. That's a form of bias because you're actually already getting people that are going to be more successful and not really including that larger kind of pool of people. But more than that, you're also not giving everybody access to the same kind of programs. So at least knowing who your population is can help. And then this kind of a process can also help to underlie any kind of process or issues you're actually seeing there. So how does this help program implementation? Gives you a clear sense of the program design, theory of change, and operations based on the logic models. I think that's kind of a big part of this. Also opportunities for dialogue and collaborative program creation. And I think when we think both the process maps as well as logic models can help with really getting people a sense of why we're doing it, what the evidence says, and then also the operational needs, and also a tool to really kind of collaborate within agencies, across agencies, and with providers. And also it probably clarifies things like referral pathways, and also what kind of information needs to be exchanged, what kind of data actually needs to move to make a client actually operational and be able to kind of work through all these different programs. But the idea here is that as we kind of think about implementation, is both what you thought was going to happen and what actually happens, and are there ways to kind of look at that on the front end and not just react to it, for the duration of the program, but also make some kind of clear choices about how you mitigate it, and then what kind of risks are you willing to take if you're not going to be doing some fidelity as intended. Okay, Ryan, were you doing this first section?
Yeah, I can take it.
Introducing it.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, we're done.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk and activate a poll since we are running short on time as usual. So polling number 2 is about contract collaboration. We're curious how many of you actually maybe sit with your providers and collaborate before releasing a bid to a contract. So really you've sat down and talked about, what's going to be included, what's the previous contract, anything you can do. All right, I'm going to let that poll run while we kind of go through a conversation here, which is, we've said this over and over again today, everything from logic models to process maps, really contracting is a partnership. You really have to sit down and think about who is going to be impacted, how do you want to approach this? And I can only say collaboration is such an amazing way to move forward to help you really focus on achieving some outcomes. Okay, let's see, are we good? Contract collaboration. I'm going to go ahead and finish the poll and we'll share results. It looks like it's
Ryan. I like Turbo Ryan here. That's good. Moving the agenda. I like it.
It is. Okay, so you can see the results now. There is not very much collaboration happening, it looks like, but let's talk about it and see what we could do to maybe move that ball forward. And I think it would be really helpful in terms of kind of just how you interact with contracts and how you ultimately continue to try and get what you are aiming to achieve at the end of the day. And providers and partners and people just delivering services also want the same thing. And so I think it's really a prime opportunity to kind of move forward with this concept. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing results. Keep multitasking here. Okay, so the next slide is really challenges to traditional contracting practices. You see kind of the overlap here of really oftentimes, and I've absolutely done this in the past, is focus on compliance rather than performance. You are so heavily focused on making sure that they follow the T's and I's of the you've crossed the T, you've dotted the I, you checked in every 22 seconds like we told you to. You forget the purpose of the contract and you start to think really kind of linear and black and white about how a contract should be implemented. But really this is a downfall sometimes when you're too focused on compliance. We've already talked about it today for a second, but really limited collaboration and capacity building. Not taking the time to sit down and really talk about what you're trying to achieve out of this, what you're trying to get. And then the third piece there is lack of collection and use of meaningful data. When I first started in rehabilitation, we were collecting hundreds of data points from providers. And when I sat down and asked people, why are we collecting, specific things? No one could come up with it. And so it became a barrier by just asking people to collect stuff we did not need, that was unnecessary. And so when you have all three of these things kind of combined together, you really create the potential for a trifecta of issues here that compound and ultimately really impact what you're trying to achieve in contracting. And so Kevin's going to walk through some opportunities in the future in terms of contracting, and I am going to talk about accountability and fidelity for a little bit in terms of what we're doing today. Kevin, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So I put this representation up because a lot of people talk about accountability and fidelity. It is kind of hard to understand in terms of what are you actually talking about when you say it. And then the county and providers. On both sides of this equation, there is a push and a pull that can happen if it's not collaborative. And so again, we just want to reinforce the collaborativeness and balance that really needs to be achieved when you're thinking about these issues. And so it's really thinking, how can we as a county or as a partner sit down with partners that are also really engaged in treatment and really want the best things? And then also, how do we make sure that everyone is being held accountable and that we're following the fidelity of the model? And so in about 2018, I started some work with the University of California, Irvine for the Department of Corrections programs, really trying to parse out the difference between accountability and fidelity. And when you think about this, you think they're often, they are woven together, but they're very distinct in what you're trying to look at. And so understanding those distinctions and that balance is really important, and doing so in a collaborative way with providers. And so in terms of the actual definitions, I want to briefly walk through them. So fidelity has a number of terms that have been used out in the public, and really it's to describe, it's the degrees of which fidelity has been described vary, but this definition, even though it varies in the literature, is really consistent in its conceptualization that fidelity really refers to a relationship between the program as it was intended and as it was designed, and then how the program is actually enacted. And so when you're thinking about fidelity, you start to think about what the evidence says about it, and you go back to that logic model that you've developed. If you're following the evidence and you're building these logic models, you can start to follow the concepts around fidelity of, did you actually implement this as it was designed? And the further you back away from that, obviously, the further you potentially back away from fidelity and ultimately getting the outcomes that you had initially read about or aimed to achieve. And then on the other side of that is accountability. And this, put very simply, is just contract compliance. There are different things in terms of contract compliance that are better measured. Again, not having 2,000 data points that no one even knows what you're using with them or why they matter, but really focused on those pieces of accountability around contract compliance that are really meaningful to make sure that you are getting what you initially intended to achieve with the contract. And in terms of accountability, there's never really been a clear off-the-shelf method for corrections, especially. There are a lot of suggestions around literature and a few studies that have best practice guides around accountability, but really this is something that you can think of individually with your county as you sit together and collaborate on them. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Sorry, I'm kind of rushing through this here. So when we talk about accountability and we talk about contract compliance, there's typically 5 dimensions that really are focused on contract accountability and contract compliance. So the first one we have, I'm going to go with the right, is program staff. So when you're talking about program staff in terms of accountability, you're thinking about measurements that really surround the staff in the program or the staff delivering the program. So that's everything from staff training and certificates to how many staff vacancies there are. So what are the ratios staff to participant? The use of non-program staff, mentors or assistants that interact with those participants, and then other staffing practices that might be important to the contract. And so when you're thinking about this spectrum of what you're looking at for program staff, those are some of the things that you want to start thinking about how you can measure it, and pulling from that logic model or pulling from the evidence where you can, or thinking about what's most important. As an example, if you have a contractor that is purely focused on mentors, and they're not receiving the training that they should be to implement the program as it was designed, you are therefore not only affecting the fidelity, but you're affecting the contract accountability when you had set up people to have a certain level of training to deliver this program. And so thinking through some of those program staff pieces. The second piece there is orientation, assessment, and planning. And so this one really focuses on collecting initial and secondary assessments. When you're thinking about putting a program in place, oftentimes you want to be able to measure why people are getting in there, what they're doing. And so some of the thoughts around that is really focus on those initial or secondary assessments, and then collecting treatment and case plans, making sure that you are tracking kind of what the progress is for people that are moving through the program. The third, excuse me, is I'm really jumping around now. Data is treatment and application. I put the circles around different than my notes. So the treatment and application are really measurements that include data around approach and intervention. What kind of curriculum are they using? What kind of dosage? What are the caseload sizes? And then orientation, progress notes, or completed Kate files. So really kind of what is that process for treatment or application? Then we're going to go to discharge planning. I'm ignoring Kevin's arrow and going to discharge planning. And we're going to talk about collecting critical information on exit interviews, exit assessments, placement into really downstream programs. How do you do more than just what is a referral outside of a program? Where are people going? Post-exit support are things you can be looking at, and really how do you get that downstream communication? And so when you're thinking about that fourth concept there of discharge planning, it's really everything that flows from it. Process maps are also really helpful in this process when you're thinking about how do we measure how people are leaving the program and where do they go? And then finally, data tracking and reporting. So some of these seem duplicative of the issues above, but really it's about ensuring that contractors or providers or anyone delivering the services is giving you the data that you're requesting. And so you've had thoughtful discussion around what are all the accountability dimensions in the contract that we need to be paying attention to. And now it's really measuring people and how they're giving that data to you and making sure that you're getting that data. Getting sporadic data or data once a month when it should be once a week is ultimately not the goal. And so when you really sit down and create these collaborative measures, measuring all of these things are really important. And so just to talk about, I'm going to put some more detailed notes on our website, but really talking about the accountability dimensions and categorizing things that you're asking for into these dimensions really helps set your program up to make sure that you're really following through on accountability and potentially impact how you develop a contract or how you sit down and collaborate with the providers on what kind of information they're sending into you, so that you can make sure that you really focus on achieving that accountability that's meaningful and thoughtful in your contracts. Okay, let's go to Fidelity. I was gonna try not to talk fast, but it is just getting faster and faster with the time here. So Fidelity Dimensions are similar to accountability. Again, it's using the evidence, using the logic model, and really playing them into what should you be tracking for your providers or people delivering services. And so again, there's 6 concepts here, and it's really about adherence to the design. So really to the extent to the intervention or the modality or the treatment, how is it actually being delivered? And so there's exposure or dose. We don't need to really get into this, but if the evidence says it should be a 26-week program that has 300 hours of dosage, you really want to follow that or measure that. And if you're straying from that, you still want to note it and follow it into the dimension around exposure or dose. There's quality and delivery of dose. This is something that comes up a lot. but really it's the manner in which a contract staff delivers a program, whether that program delivery is really the theoretical ideal. And so when you think about people delivering CBI treatment and they haven't been fully trained in how to deliver CBI treatment, you're not getting a quality of delivery or dosage, and you're not going to ultimately get those outcomes that you need. And so you start to see these aspects woven together from accountability and fidelity, but it's such an important concept of looking at that evidence and looking at that program design and trying to follow it so you actually can achieve the fidelity and the outcomes that you had intended from the beginning. Participant responsiveness is also another dimension that was really important. How do you measure how people are progressing through? What can you do in terms of, are there data points that you can extract from the system or from providers that really says how people are responding? Are they getting less violations? Is there some assessment that they could do to show a reduction in criminal thinking? All of those kinds of things, including even case notes, conversations with people about their being more responsive to the program or ways to measure this responsiveness piece. And then program differentiation. This is discussed in the logic model and in a contract example that is going to be provided. But really, how are you differentiating from the program? Are there identifying or unique features of the program that really need to be called out and measured? Those things are really important to kind of measure in terms of fidelity and design. And then reach and scope is the last one. It's really the rate of involvement and representative of participants. So thinking about program completion, are the needs of participants met? What does that actually mean when you say it? And even though these are dimensions that we're talking about today, and I don't have a ton of time, I have no time to dive in deep to them, when you start thinking about program design or you start thinking about questions or data, and you start to categorize them in these accountability and fidelity dimensions, you can really start to think about trying to get yourself on the best path to achieve not only contract compliance that's collaborative and fidelity dimensions that's collaborative, but really how do you start putting yourself on a pathway to get those outcomes so that when you start doing process evaluations or outcome evaluations, that you're already setting yourself up to be a winner in that sense and get things done. Kevin, let's slide to the next slide. Slide to the next slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry, one back. I was saying it twice because it didn't make sense. So I have notes in here and I definitely won't read these, but really there is true importance of both of these. And so thinking about them as separate and distinct measurement tools is really critical. And so I think just, go back and take a look at these in more detail, but really trying to be thoughtful about how you're categorizing these dimensions, how you're asking questions, and how you're being collaborative and what those expectations are really important. The last thing I'll say on this, before I toss it back to Kevin, is collaboration. This should not be, in terms of when you think about accountability and contract or fidelity in terms of program delivery, this should not be something that's a surprise. People kicking in a door and doing case file reviews as a surprise to providers, and the providers have no idea what you're going to ask them or what you're looking at, is not a way to achieve fidelity. It's not a way to achieve collaboration. It's not going to be helpful to your program. Sitting down up front and thinking about these dimensions and how you can start asking relevant questions and collecting information in each of these areas as a collaborative process between providers and counties, or even people delivering services that are part of the county, really start to think about, how do we put this on the ball forward so no one is surprised about what we're aiming to achieve. Let me give one quick example of fidelity before I move it to Kevin. In some conversations we've had with researchers in the past, if people have a low adherence to fidelity, even if they think they're following the model that they created, but that model is slightly strayed, and they build a logic model, and that logic model slightly strayed from the evidence, and then they get to actual implementation, and they're not paying attention to fidelity. They're not paying attention to the dimensions. They're not asking questions around it. And so that slightly strays from the fidelity. By the time you get to a low or even moderate adherence to fidelity, you actually might be increasing, for instance, recidivism. And the studies that we reviewed where the programs were focused on recidivism reduction, there was a 20% recidivism increase instead of doing nothing because they had a low adherence to fidelity. And so when you're thinking about these concepts, you're really thinking about how important it is to really set you and the provider up on the right path so that you can achieve outcomes that you both expected, and those outcomes are really making positive impacts in your county. And so I'm going to toss it back to Kevin. Kevin, you have 2 minutes. Good luck. We're going to put some more information on the website around the dimensions of accountability and fidelity and some of the questions that would be contained in there, so you can start thinking about when you're developing contracts, how to really inform these discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And I think as we're kind of looking at this, like what are the kind of the approaches to do this? And I think it's kind of some areas that we've kind of talked about before. And I think kind of as I kind of think of different things you could do, but using needs assessment and other existing data to make sure you can identify service priorities. The program inventory itself can help to understand what you need to do and what the areas of capacity are or wait lists. Using actually research from the clearinghouses and kind of from the evidence base to actually understand what is effective programming. And then also using cost benefit analysis to know how much recidivism are we going to have to buy to kind of how much when we actually go out for a contract, how is this going to actually generate returns to the community in terms of what we want to see in a return on investment, and how do we value that? Because you can have all these different contracts out there, but how do you actually know what it's actually returning in terms of what that contract is worth and what that's buying in terms of things like recidivism reduction, engagement and treatment, things that you really care about. So in the spirit of actually, instead of like doing but showing, if I say it right, actually want to do an example from Santa Cruz. And actually, Sarah Jameson is actually on the call today, and they actually went through a really, I think, useful and actually kind of inspiring process for developing kind of better RFPs and actually infusing a lot of different kind of data into their process. And I actually wanted to have her kind of like take the last couple minutes to actually talk about their process and what they learned about implementing some of these characteristics and some of these ideas, because they actually did it. And I think it's probably better for them to talk about them than to me talk about it. So Sarah, if you want to come off mute and kind of tell a little bit about your experience kind of trying to do this kind of work on the contracting side.
Yeah, great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so Santa Cruz County, I mean, we've had a history of legacy contracts, and we really wanted to really take a new framework and worked with Results First and CSAC and all these agencies really to identify, what is it costing, what is recidivism costing us, and really move to kind of a network collective impact model. And it's great to listen to this whole thing that's been going on, because what I keep hearing is collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And we wouldn't have gotten where we've gotten without that collaboration. And we still have a lot of work to do. We are very data driven. We had a lot of piecemeal programs or programs that were extremely bundled that wanted to do all the case management. And what we realized is we work with a population that tends to be in crisis, and we would refer to services, but all the providers were just dealing with the very low level basic needs, not understanding the system and not really trusting that some of this stuff was happening. We never really got providers to get deep into the evidence-based dosage and delivering the service that was really intended. So we really did a collaborative RFP process. We presented the data that we're looking at here, the data, the needs of the clients as we're serving. We described where these clients might be located. A big part of it is breaking a lot of the myths. A lot of people think, oh, people are in custody for long periods of time. That's a great time to program. In our community, people are in and out. We can't do a 12-week anger management because they're either moving between different facilities or they're being released, and the impact wasn't there. So we really had to, again, keep shifting and looking at what is the data telling us, and then bringing the providers aboard and getting them to trust in the system, that we are trying to create a collective system, and that certain case management aspects will be delivered by other partners that allows other providers to focus on the more intensive services that they were intended to deliver, rather than everybody kind of addressing that low level case management. Everybody needs a driver's license. You got 15 providers doing the same thing for one particular client and not ever getting to the deep interventions that we were expecting to have an impact. And then really bringing our stakeholders, the board of supervisors. Everybody wants to know, what is that one program that has the greatest impact on recidivism? And it's a real opportunity, and we're still 5 years in, still teaching the collective impact model, that each one of these programs is providing an intervention at a certain time within the system or at a certain time within supervision, either to prevent a recidivating effect, or some of it is in response to a recidivating event. So, sometimes it's on the front end, sometimes it's on the back end. So it's very difficult then to actually look at which program has that impact, because some programs are in response to rather than an intervention or a prevention. Bringing the providers aboard so that they see the big picture and where they fit in, and having them trust that these clients' needs are being met is really, really important. And then as an agency, having the capacity to work with the providers to continue to move them forward. And I would say that that has been maybe one of our issues here with continuing the good work we're doing, is we kind of have moments where we get stuck, where we have competing priorities and can't quite have the capacity to help bring providers forward. Another piece of it is probation funds things such as MI training for our providers, trauma-informed system training for our providers. We fund training so they understand probation supervision strategies. So a lot of it is also investing in the providers by hosting these trainings and kind of sometimes making it mandatory as part of their contract to participate, so they're aware of the larger system and their role. I hope that helped. I know I had to be quick.
Oh, that was perfect. Because I think, what I think Santa Cruz did, it really kind of covered a lot of this, the ideas that we're kind of trying to put out there of collaboration, using data where you can to inform it, but knowing you got to still support providers, bring kind of the board members along, all those different groups. It really isn't just, here's a contract, let's put it out there, let's see what we get back. It really is an opportunity for engagement. And this is kind of the last thing we'll kind of cover here. The one thing I think that Sarah got to is that in their assessment of kind of what was being done program-wise versus what clients needed, was they kind of found out, I'm trying to highlight it here, a lot of the effort was going on over here with these, kind of, I would say, not quite the interventions of the layout, really to kind of change criminal thinking, really address criminogenic needs, life skills, social skill development, case management, which is really where all the effort was going. But pretty clearly, the needs that didn't even met were actually around criminal thinking. And I think that's really squares with what most of the literature is going to say about what, if you meet those kind of needs around criminal thinking, you're going to impact everything else too. So how do we make sure we're aligning our programming to actually meet the needs of the clients, not just what's already in place? And I think what you'll also see in the RFP that's going to be on our website is a great example of how you make that RFP a really clear document, what you expect from your providers, what they need to do about it, what they need to respond to in their RFP to actually effectively say they understand what the clients need, they will meet those, not just put the same thing they put in there all the time. So I think that document is a really great starting place to kind of steal some of the language from it. And also Sarah's a great resource. And I think, as she pointed out too, it does take staff to do all this monitoring. You can't just put RFPs out there and hope it'll monitor itself. It takes staff to actually take it, internalize it, and work with providers. So I think they've set up some really great programs there and some really great approaches, but it does take an ongoing effort and ongoing commitment to really doing this in a way that's really robust. So I'm going to jump to the last slide here, and we're out of time. Sorry, no Q&A. We do some resources on our site for various things, and we're putting together kind of a contracting toolkit that's going to kind of look at how we include logic models, process maps, and some other kind of tips and tricks that we've kind of found over the years that hopefully will be kind of a good starting place. There's an example logic model that I mentioned before that actually has intimate partner violence there as an example, but you can kind of flip it out of the Word document and use it for whatever you want. Santa Cruz's RFP example and its full form and beauty, if you like reading, it's a good tip, 100+ pages, fascinating, especially the boilerplate language. Harvard Performance Lab actually did some kind of thinking about this a while back about how to create results-driven contracting and how that could work. So it's a couple of pages of kind of think piece. And then also the Pew MacArthur Results First Initiative also put together some kind of practical case study about how to use evidence in the contracting process as well. So there's a lot of kind of good kind of pieces out there. We're hoping this can be at least kind of get folks started on it, kind of know kind of where to kind of like what some of the pieces might be. And then as we kind of work forward as a group, where we can help kind of fill in some of the gaps or support you all doing that. Ryan, I'm going to throw that as a looking ahead piece.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so looking ahead, we have more seminars. So in March, we're going to be doing our data strategy part 3, and that's really kind of taking everything we did in the first 2 around where to access data and how to access data, and really start thinking about how you integrate that and store that in terms of building data dashboards. And so it's going to be an exciting one because it starts to really round out the thought and the discussions that we've had in the first 2 series on that. So that's in March. And then in April for the programming series, we have our 4th, which is the first discussion on the cost benefit, part 1, and really kind of looking at how you start to apply the concepts of an economic analysis to justice system and your programs, and really thinking about how to show, these are headed in the right path, either nationally or locally, when you start thinking about where you want to go with outcome evaluations and really start to get to that local information, which is so critical and important. Okay, we are way over. So I just want to say thank you. We are available to help out if you have any questions, or if you're struggling with some piece of this, you want to know more information about it. We are here. You have your partners between Kevin, Mia, and Mike, and then I'm always available as well. And I just wanted to say thank you for joining us today. I know it's a busy time, and we really appreciate your time and discussion. And looking forward to seeing you at the next one and in the interim at our meetings that are ongoing. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody, and week.